My name is Marlon Gill. I'm an active member of the Humboldt Permaculture Guild. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This is a special monthly meeting where we're hosting our local expert here, Sam Polly, which I'll get to in a minute. But before I get to that, I just want to make a couple of announcements. The first is that one of the reasons we're having this meeting tonight is to prepare the community for an event that we're hosting at the end of the month. And that event is our second annual fruit tree and scion exchange. So it's based on the same premise of our seed and plant exchange, where we're inviting the community to bring what they're growing and share it with the rest of the community. This is a project that's been in the works for 3 years now. Last year was the first exchange where we had the community come over to one of our local member, Dick Hance's house here in Bayside, where we had Sam Polly and we were able to actively graft on trees and exchange our scion wood. So this year the format will be a little bit different. We'll be at the Bayside Grange where we can just come together and share our scion wood with each other, so that we're, you know, propagating our local cultivars that do good in our greater bioregion. So with that, I'd also like to premise our 17th annual Seed and Plant Exchange, which is the event that many of you might know us from. So 17 years in the making. Last year, over 1,000 people showed up. So this year, I believe it's the 29th, is that right, Liban, of March? The last Saturday in March, 28th. So that'll be this 28th of March on Saturday, and so please bring your seeds and invite your friends and family to that event as well. That's at the Arcata Community Center. And on that same note, we're having a planning meeting here next Tuesday at 5:30. So if anybody's interested in helping out with the Seed and Plant Exchange, we'd love some new energy. We can use the energy. It's a 100% community-run event, and so the more people involved, the better it is, and the easier it is for the people who organize it. So yeah, come by next Tuesday if you want to participate in the Seed and Plant Exchange. And on that, I'd like to introduce a local who's become a good friend of mine over the years. Sam has been living in this area for many years now. He's been grafting trees since his teens. Probably grafted hundreds, if not thousands, of fruit trees by this point in his life. His father owns an orchard here in Fieldbrook, and he's actively involved in edible landscaping, which he does for a living for a streamline planning and consultant based here out of Arcata. He's a really great guy. We're really happy to have him. We're honored to have him. He's a encyclopedia of information. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sam Polly.
Thanks. All right, thanks for coming. It looks like a good turnout tonight. It's the most crammed I've seen this room. So I have an outline that I have been teaching grafting workshops like every year for about the last 15 years. It started out at A&L Feed and then Miller Farms, and now a number of other places. And I teach classes on soils and pruning and grafting all over the place. And I didn't want to follow my exact outline this time because it's the same thing I taught last year at the Scion Exchange and probably go over again. But I'll probably cover some of it just to kind of give you guys an introduction, but I wanted to go a little bit more broad in this presentation and just talk about plant propagation in general. And I come from as far back as I know in my family. My grandparents all were in agriculture down south with fruit trees, and then my dad taught agriculture at McKinleyville High for 34 years and was into grafting and having orchards and stuff. He still has an orchard out in Fieldbrook, sells at farmers market and all kinds of fruits. And one of the things, I work for Streamline Planning Consultants here in Arcata, and we do environmental planning, all different aspects, getting like developers through the CEQA process and doing wetland delineations and getting people out of trouble with government agencies. And one of the things I've seen that I personally feel is maybe one of the greatest lacks in our planning and society is getting more of a food infrastructure and empowering the local people to produce their own food. And one of the ways I see that is community-based edible landscaping, not just like a edible landscape in an apartment complex or a hospital, but all over. I mean, at the hospitals, the apartment complexes, the right-of-ways along the roads, parks, wherever you can go. And what I continually see is people installing these ornamental landscapes that take all this infrastructure, irrigation, and a lot of times pesticides and all this work because they're so tender, and it doesn't make any sense. Why not have something that's medicinal or edible or has some kind of useful wood you can harvest off every so often to make stuff out of? And it's really crazy, and there's a big movement, I think, really around the world now to do this, especially in Europe and cities like Seattle and Portland. They're doing it. But around here, I've had the privilege just in this last year to install the edible walkway along 17th Street going off of Alliance down there. And you can go walk along 100 yards of all kinds of shrubs and trees just installed this past year. And, you know, they're all babies, but even with the driest year on record, because we installed mycorrhizal fungi and compost blanket and then mulch over the top of that, the stuff just took off running in the middle of a horrendously dry summer with no water whatsoever. The stuff's thriving. It's phenomenal. And then also I got to design and install the Fieldbrook Food Forest, the eco garden out there in Fieldbrook behind the community church across from the school. And it's just so amazing to see people come and visit, and it's wow, I mean, the excitement. People are into this stuff. And at the planning end of it, the cities and municipalities, they don't want to hear anything about it. There's just so many layers of politics. And it was actually a guy at MCSD told me, hey, go talk to some of these churches. They have a different set of politics in the cities. And so I talked to Fieldbrook Church, and we're down with that. We're all gardeners. Hey, let's do it. Just, what do you need? Where do you need us? Where do we need to do stuff? And I was like, I've never had that before, where I could just say, you guys work over there. Let's do this. Can we get some funding for that? And boom, it went from 1,000 square foot project ready by next year to a 1/4 acre ready last August. It's like, whoa, I've never seen that before. Try to get a project. I'm doing a project in the city of Eureka right now, and it's just going nowhere. I do like $4,000 worth of planning, and then some agency shoots us down and we're back to the drawing board. It's maddening. So what this is all about, this and the sign exchange, the seed exchange, is empowering us and our friends and our neighbors and the community to take control of our own food. And I mean, you can choose your varieties that are locally adapted or varieties that fit your palate. I mean, it's really exciting. Even when I was a kid and I started learning how to graft and prune, it's like, wow, I get to control what variety this tree turns into. Or I want to put 30 varieties of apples on this one tree, and now I can have this like smorgasbord of apples. And it's just really exciting to have that kind of option. And so that's what we're looking at, is empowering ourselves and being able to teach this stuff to kids, friends, neighbors, whoever. You know, you look at empowerment of survival. I've always been into the outdoors and learning survival skills and stuff. And you think about the basic necessities. What would happen? Like my wife, she's from the Philippines. They have typhoons, volcanoes. I mean, pretty much every catastrophe you can think of completely wipes out whole communities. And think about what would happen if we had another flood of '64, but now all of a sudden our hillsides and our right-of-ways and all these places are jammed with all that edible stuff, and the helicopters can't get in here, but we have all these berries that are ripe in the middle of winter and these nut crops and all this stuff. It's like, wow, we wouldn't be hurting quite so bad. And the more of that stuff we get, the better off we're going to be. The healthier we're going to be. The less carbon footprint and diesel going down 299 we're going to be using. It just makes sense. And of those necessities, food, water, clothes, shelter, well, this covers the food aspect of it. And it's just a lot more sustainable, a lot more fun. The people that know me real well too know that I have 6 kids, and I've been training them. My little kids we're going down the highway. Oh, look at that horrible pruning job, Daddy. What'd they do to that tree? They know how to prune. They know these varieties. They know the animals and the plants, the native plants growing along the ditches and stuff. It's just a really wonderful way to live here. And so not just grafting, but overall edible plant propagation is something I think that's a real critical component. That's why it's exciting to see these groups showing up we've been getting at these events. So having said that, to focus it down a little bit more, my area that I've specialized in is perennial crops. I've grown strawberries and some other things, but fruit crops, apple, plum, pear, pine nuts, those kinds of things are something that once you get them established, they can pretty much go on their own. I kind of think about, okay, we have a big catastrophe, maybe a 10 on the Richter scale earthquake. Just trashes our society. We're cut off. The highways are thrashed. What's going to really do the job in terms of providing us food? Well, these perennial crops, if all of a sudden I'm busy taking care of my kids and maybe fixing up a shelter or something, these crops are producing the food on their own. They don't need that much care. And so like with a food forest, once you get it going, you don't need to do that much. And these crops, you don't have to plant them every year. The longer they grow, the bigger they get, the more they produce. It's just, that's kind of my line of thinking. Now, the plant propagation, like I mentioned, I'm not just going to focus on grafting here. I'm going to kind of mention some different techniques, because I've, especially this last few years, gotten more and more into other techniques as I've gotten involved with these food forests and edible walkway and stuff. But I'll talk about grafting last here, but there's several different methods. Some of you might be familiar with some of them. And I've found that even people with a lot of experience find you start experimenting. Different plants have their little nuances about how they want to be propagated. Some plants you can propagate a number of ways, and other plants have to be propagated a very specific way. And I've found that with plants like apples, plums, if you take a seed out of those fruits and stick them in the ground, a lot of times they'll grow up into a genetic apple or plum, but they won't have any fruit at all, or they might have a little green thing that's inedible. And so if you want to say this is, I can't remember what Marlon said this one is, but let's just say it's a Golden Delicious. And you grow it up, you take some apples off of it, you plant those seeds, you'll get green delicious, green nasty, red delicious, red nasty, non-fruiting. You'll get a bunch of weird stuff. It's genetically diverse. And so if you want to propagate this, you cut some of this wood off and you graft it onto another tree, and now that branch will be that exact same Golden Delicious. So that's how you propagate that one apple. And it really empowers you, because if you find maybe Golden Delicious, or you pick any variety like Waltana, doesn't do well in Humboldt County. It gets apple scab and turns all corky and shrivels up, and so the commercial guys would just spray them all year to keep them healthy and looking nice. Well, I don't have time to spray, for one. Two, I'm just not into that. And so if all of a sudden I find in this orchard there's one Waltana that for some reason it's like a little bit mutated and it just doesn't seem to get the disease, I can cut that wood off now, graft it on here, and I have a disease-resistant version. Some of these new varieties like this apple Sansa, S-A-N-S-A, bit my first one last year. It's like, oh yeah, there is a winner. When you find something that's just like off the chart in flavor, doesn't have the scab and the diseases, that's a winner. And like I know some people like the older varieties like Kings and stuff better, but I really like Surprise and Liberty and some of those. And they don't scab up. They do well here. They produce every year. So those are real winners. This Sansa one I'm really excited about, just because it's like the newest one I've found that's right up there at the top of the chart in terms of productivity, flavor, lack of disease, lack of care, and all that kind of stuff. So you can now get pieces of cuttings off of that when you find somebody with that variety and graft it onto a branch of your tree or on a new rootstock. And if all of a sudden we were hurting and society was thrashed because we had some catastrophe, and you can't just call up so-and-so nursery in Michigan or Oregon, hey, I need 20 rootstocks. Get an apple, grow the seeds, and then graft onto those seedlings, and now you've got your variety. So there are ways from like a survival standpoint that you could produce trees cheaply, and especially if you're out in the outskirts like where Dick and me, my dad live, you have deer coming in all the time, you're going to want standard big trees anyway, so the seedlings would probably be a good route to go. If you're in town, in an apartment you have a little patio thing on the second floor, you're probably going to be wanting a potted bonsai fruit tree, or get a dwarf or something. But anyway, the point is this grafting and knowing how to propagate trees empowers you to get these specific varieties that you like for your area. Now I'm going to just kind of blow through a few of these different methods, and I don't have like time to demonstrate everything, but one of the most common ways of propagating fruit plants is cuttings. You've probably heard of cuttings. Some of you might have done them before. And I found, I had classes, ornamental propagation and stuff in college where we did cuttings, and oh boy, that's really great, that works so well. And then you go to do some other plants. Maybe your friend has a really cool berry plant, and you get some cuttings off of it, and maybe you dip them in hormone and you stick them in the perlite mix or whatever, and then they all die, and you're like, farmer. What? I follow the textbook and it doesn't work. That's what you'll find. A lot of plants, even maybe some types within the certain species, just don't want to be propagated by cuttings. Or maybe, you know, you did it out in a flat on a table and it needed more humidity, so you needed to make a little, you know, mini greenhouse out of a big inflated bag or something, or do it in a full-blown greenhouse. And I mean, temperature, humidity, time of year, all these things play in. And some plants, you might have 10 different plants that like to be done by cuttings in the spring, but then this one just, it keeps dying every time, and you do it in the middle of winter and boom, you get roots. Like, whoa. So a lot of this stuff's just playing around with it and knowing the basic techniques. So if I was going to take, and it's, I have gotten fruit wood to root before, but it's just generally a lot better to get a specific rootstock, because those rootstocks have been bred for disease resistance, insect resistance, and to grow a certain size. Like semi-dwarfs are very common. They grow about 70% the size of a full-blown tree. And so if you take your scion wood, your graft wood off of the variety you like, and you graft that onto these specific rootstocks, they're all going to come out the same. They're going to be a controllable size that you wanted, and very resistant to some of these wicked diseases and insects that just destroy rootstocks. So that's the advantage, another advantage of grafting, and that's why you typically use specific rootstocks. But having said that, I have gotten them to root before. Those roots won't be as good as one of the specific rootstocks, but that you can do it. But a lot of other, like berry plants, are better for cutting. So what you typically do is you just cut maybe a chunk of the plant off, maybe down here, and you get 4 buds. The bottom 2 buds, you strip all the leaves off, and I even break the buds off, and then you cut just below that bottom bud. And I typically use some rooting hormone, but sometimes I don't, and it works just fine. Depends on the plant. And then you stick the cutting into some soil. I usually punch a hole with my finger or a stick, and then stick the cutting so those 2 bottom buds are below the soil level, firm it up, and then with the top 2 leaves that are remaining, I usually cut them in half, just so there's less surface area that's transpiring moisture and drying the plant out. And then cut off the stem above that top bud. So you have 2 buds underground, 2 buds above ground. And it's so cool when all of a sudden you see a little bud start to form and pop out, and you know it's starting to root and starting to grow. And for cuttings, mulberries do really well, currants do really well. Let's see if I wrote anything else. Luma is a lot of people don't know about lumas, but they're a little purple huckleberry type of berry from South America, and they're a real winner. I think they're going to be, as people start to know about them. We have them in our food forest and edible walkway. They just grow really well. I've done cuttings and seed on those, and they do really well. So it's really fun. I mean, it's just so easy. Walk by a sidewalk with an edible walkway, oh, that thing's growing big. I'm not going to hurt the plant by taking a little twig. Boom. Make a couple of cuttings, stick them in a pot. A lot of times I'll take a 1-gallon pot and just punch 4 holes and stick 4 cuttings in there, and you have a little nursery right there. And later, if they all start to grow, take it out, chop it in 4 pieces, and you have 4 plugs ready to go. So cuttings are a wonderful way of propagating plants. Layering is good for service berries. There's different forms of layering, but you can do air layering, where you make a slice in the stem, maybe cut up, pull the piece you sliced out, stick a toothpick in there so it holds it apart, maybe put some hormone on there, wrap it with sphagnum moss or some kind of aerated but moist material, put a plastic bag over it, seal it top and bottom, and then it eventually starts to root. And then you can just come back, cut it off, boom, new plant. Another way is to bend it over and stick it in the ground and bury part of it, and it'll actually root off of the buds. And plants like your berry vines, tayberries, blackberries, those kind of plants, raspberries do real well with that. A lot of times you can just stick the end right in the ground and they'll just take off. So layering is a good way.
Grapes.
Yeah, grapes. Yeah, a number of vine type plants. Seed, like I mentioned, I kind of just jumbling all this stuff together, but if you take seeds in most of your fruit crops like apples and plums, you get something totally different you didn't want, a lot of times undesirable. Nut pines, oaks, even peaches can do pretty well from seed. It might not be exactly what you had, but I had a friend down in Atascadero, and he planted a bunch of peach seeds off of his tree and got some really killer, slight variations of what the tree was, but they were great. So there are a few fruit plants that will go by seed, so it's kind of a matter of playing around with this stuff. Budding is what you do with citrus, and that's where you basically just slice off a bud where one of these leaves is coming off, and then on the plant, the rootstock, you make a T cut in the bark, peel the bark up and stick that bud in there at a certain time of year, and that bud will grow and take off. And then there's some plants, and I haven't done much of it with edible plants. I've done it with like rain garden and bioswale plants that are native. But as root cutting, you just take a piece of root, stick it in a pot, and it'll shoot up a stem. So that's another way. But grafting is the one that I've done the most of. Like Marlon said, I've done thousands of grafts. Mostly whip grafts, but I've done some cleft grafts and bark grafts and different kinds. But grafting is just a really cool thing to be able to do. And it's something that if you haven't done it before, it can be kind of intimidating. I've been teaching classes on it for I think about 15 years. And out of a class of 15 or 20 people, there's always a couple people that just can't figure it out. A couple of people never even heard about it really before, and they just really gifted with it. And a lot of people just have to do some practice and then they get it down. So it's not that complicated a thing to learn. It's just a few basic things to understand. Looks like I still got plenty of time to explain it. So basically grafting is taking a short piece of stem of one plant and grafting onto a compatible other plant, which would be your rootstock. And it can be a full-grown tree or a little new rootstock. And the big key is they have to be genetically compatible. So a Douglas fir will not graft onto an apple tree. And there are a number of, like any kind of apple will graft onto another apple. And in a lot of cases you can get something like a quince and get certain fruit plants to grow onto that. And Marlon, did you bring enough for people to grab on these handouts?
Yeah, there's a few, not too many.
Okay. And we'll have more of these at the sign exchange for people, but this is a grafting affinity chart. And so you can look down here and say quince. Okay, there's quince go across. Apple. Apple will graft onto quince, but there's a US there, unsatisfactory. And let's see, I think it was apricot rootstocks I dug up, and I grafted plum onto it, and it took immediately. I was like, oh cool, they're compatible. And the plum grew up about here, and that's all it ever grew again. It was alive, it grew every year, it would leaf out, but it stayed that big. It was like a bonsai permanently. It was unsatisfactory, but it was genetically compatible. Not gonna get fruit off of that. Pear will graft onto, actually this is the scion here, so quince onto apple, quince onto pear, unsatisfactory. Quince onto quince, somewhat compatible. Let's see, so I'll go across here to quince. Quince onto apple, unsatisfactory. Or no, wait, this is where'd we go?
Allegedly medlar goes on quince.
Really? I'll have to try that. Because quince rootstocks are, I mean, they just kick out rootstocks, you gotta dig them up. Let's see, okay, so apple. Yeah, apple onto quince is unsatisfactory. Let's see, pear onto quince is somewhat compatible. And so it's, yeah, so it kind of gives you a range. And if you want like a apricot to, what's the one I mentioned, plum, peach to apricot, sometimes one will go on to the other, but the other won't go on to the one. So, you understand that? It's, and so you want to refer to something like this before you do it because you can waste a lot of time. Having said that, I like to experiment, so if you have something that says unsatisfactory, don't be afraid of trying it out. You might get something cool. Let's see. So the one thing I really wanted to focus on a little bit was scion wood. Marlon kind of mentioned this, and collecting scion wood, your graft cuttings that you're going to graft onto, it's not that big of a mystery. It's really common sense. Having said that, man, probably 80% of the time people go, oh, I scored some really great scion wood, and I can get that, don't even let me touch that. It's contaminated. And if you look at the tops of especially older trees, you'll see all kinds of stuff. Even if you don't know anything about plants and fruit trees, it looks a little bit funny. Give you an example is, I mean, you look at, these are good examples of some plum branches here. Does this look pretty healthy to you?
Yeah, it's 1 year's growth. It looks pretty healthy.
There's absolutely no indication of disease or anything funky on that. Now, if you can use your imagination a little bit, picture 30 branches about this size coming off right here, like this. Do you want to cut that and get graft wood off of that? No, it's a virus called witch's broom, and as soon as you cut into that, now your tools are contaminated, and then you graft onto that, that tree's contaminated, toast, you made a mess. Don't go there. There was a guy, a contractor, that lived up on the hill there in McKinleyville, and he hired some Joe Blow landscape co to come in and prune his trees, and they just started with a diseased tree, got their tools contaminated, went through and wiped out the entire orchard. Just, I mean, old heirloom trees, some of them didn't even have names, and he would just treasure, wiped out, and just spread disease all over. So if you see a witch's broom, maybe go down like 18 inches, cut that off, burn the thing or put it in the trash, and then dip your tools in disinfectant. You don't want to go there. Okay, another example. These aren't bad. These are just stretch cracks from the tree expanding. But look how those cracks, see how those cracks look. Be looking for that kind of stuff, you know, funky tears in the bark. These knobs are probably just little burls, but be looking for that kind of thing. That's not, see how nice and healthy and smooth this is? It looks a little bit funky. Those are probably fine. I don't see those as disease, but those are the types of things you want to start looking out for. Wait a minute, that's not nice and smooth. And I forgot my pictures tonight, but I have pictures of stuff like this where all of a sudden it's all over the trunk combined with this. Looks like somebody took a torch and burned it. That's probably a bacteria or a fungus that's nuking that branch, and you don't want to cut anywhere near that except to get rid of it. Cut, you know, 18 inches down or so, saw that thing off, burn it, and then disinfect your tools. So when you're collecting sign wood, you want nice, smooth, clean looking, healthy stuff. Any kind of darkness, knobs, cracks, dense clusters of twigs, virus, bacteria, or fungus, it's going to get you. It'll contaminate your tools and destroy the tree that you're trying to graft. On that note, I mentioned disinfectant. I looked up a bunch of disinfectants, and there's, I think, there's 4 basic ones people typically use. They have commercial disinfectants for like arborists, these toxic chemicals and stuff, but when I first started grafting, I used bleach, and I guess I'd heard a lot of people use bleach, and it's really effective. And you have a little tub of bleach, and you stick your tools in there for 5 minutes, and then pull them out, and you go, what happened? It's rusted solid. Bleach nukes your tools. Don't do it. Alcohol, I get the 70%, yeah, 70, 90%, 91% alcohol. They typically sell 50 or 70, but you get the 91%. It's just stronger. I don't have scientific data showing that it does anything, but I've noticed when I kind of continually spray my tools with 91% isopropyl alcohol, I don't get disease spreading whether I'm pruning or grafting. And I like to tell a story. I was in, I think it was actually when I first moved back up here from college, and I had my fruit tree nursery going again, and I would disinfect after each tree I grafted, which, if you picture 400 trees, that's time consuming. Spray, spray, wipe down. So I thought, I'll just start doing it each row. Don't cut corners. So I came back as the trees were growing, and one whole row, I'd started right off the bat cutting some contaminated wood or something, and went through and cut, as I cut each rootstock off to graft onto it, contaminated them, had a whole row with some virus, wiped out that row. So that's a lot of time and a lot of value I lost there. So make sure you carefully disinfect your tools. And like I mentioned, if there's some canker up here from a fungus and you cut that off, make sure you hose your saw or your loppers down before you move on to another cut. So I've had, with the alcohol, really good success just keeping my tools moist, especially if I cut through anything suspicious. And get some kind of spray bottle, just dump it in there, and then you can just hang it on a tree branch, or if you're grafting, just have it sitting around a table. But I like these because they can hang, and these ProSafe bottles have been really good. I used to go through bottles all the time, and once I started using these, they don't break. They just keep going. And it saves you having to dip stuff all the time. One thing to watch out for is wind direction. Get a whole lung full of alcohol. That's no good. So I typically collect like 10 to 12 inch pieces, and then especially like this time of year I might collect them. I'm busy, I haven't got my rootstock yet or whatever. I'll collect them, wrap them in moist, not drenched, but moist paper towels, put them in a plastic bag and seal them up, just stick them in the refrigerator, and I've held them there for actually up to like 6 months and still had it viable. And like March, when I thought it was too late to be doing whip grafting, graft on the trees took. So, sooner you can get it grafted, the better, but they will store for a long time in cold storage. Collect them while they're dormant this time of year, get them in the refrigerator, and they can last a long time, and that moisture is really key.
Can you talk about selective grafting the scion wood?
Yeah.
12-inch pieces?
Oh yeah, I almost forgot about that. So the big part of selection is, like I mentioned, getting good, healthy stuff. But there's another aspect that's critical. You guys think this piece would make good scion wood? Doesn't even look like it has any viable buds anymore, but this is old growth. You don't want, you probably have seen or heard of the spurs on chickens' feet and pheasants and those kinds of game birds. They have these spurs. These buds down here are fruit spurs. They look just like spurs on a chicken. Those are old growth and they're fruiting. They're not vegetative. You want vegetative wood. And so this is an excellent example. If you were going to be grafting plum trees, you would want to cut this off. You don't want to use this section here. This is the old growth. And you can usually see a weird squiggle like it's melted there. That's where this stopped growing and then this took off this year. So this is the new growth. And if you look at it, these are plum spurs. They're a little bit more clustery than the apple spurs, but it's the same thing. These are fruiting buds here with fruit wood on them. And these are fruiting clusters here on the end. You don't want this stuff. It doesn't have, one, if it does have vegetative buds in it, it'll shoot out 90 degrees to this. It'll look funky and not give you a straight tree. But this stuff here is pretty much dominantly vegetative shoots, and it's really young and viable. So you cut these pieces off, and you want to try to match the diameter of your scion wood to the diameter of your rootstocks, if you can. Well, it's not always possible, but the closer they are in size, the better matchup you'll get. And then, you know, anywhere along this new growth piece, if I had a really skinny rootstock, I'd go towards the end. If it's a thicker one, I'd go down here as low as possible. And I typically cut off a section that has 2 buds. So just above one bud, I'll cut it off, and then I'll go 1, 2, and cut it off above the next bud. I used to do 3 buds, but almost every time 2 or 3 of them grow, and then you're coming back pinching off a bunch of extra growth. And if you do just 1 bud, which you can, but a lot of times that bud gets bumped or it's just not viable and it dies, and now you wasted that whole season on that tree. So if you do 2 buds, that gives you a pretty good chance at least one of them is going to grow. If both of them grow, it's not that time consuming. Come back and break one off. So does that answer your question as far as selecting? You want the new vegetative stuff, not the older stuff down here. So these and this are your new vegetative stuff. This thick piece down here that has all these fruiting spurs and these branches you don't want. And a lot of times you'll find trees that have almost no vegetative growth. They didn't really grow that year. You have these pieces like this that aren't even thick enough to graft, and then you're a little bit stuck. So you have to make a judgment call at that point. You try to graft this dinky piece, do you prune the tree and wait till next year when it explodes out? Or do you find a piece here that has maybe a little, looks like a vegetative bud? Or you could graft a piece of this, and when that grows out, you bend it and you'll have a slightly funky shape. Do you have a question, Marlon?
Can you cut some samples to pass around of some scion wood?
Yeah.
Can you show what is a vegetative bud or what's a fruiting?
All right. So this is real easy. These are all vegetative on this new growth. You can kind of pass that around. Try not to trip on my wires here. So all these, you'll notice these buds are oriented somewhat in the same direction as the limb they're on. So these are all new season's growth. And you see how tight the buds are. They're wrapped right up against the trunk. Those are vegetative buds. But this piece, these are all fruit buds, and they're really clustered. They're sticking out more perpendicular to the branch. Those are your fruit buds.
What is a vegetative bud mean?
That means it's going to grow vegetation, leaves and stems.
You don't want it to grow fruit.
Right. You want it, when you're grafting, you want it to grow a stem like this. It's going to shoot up and start giving you a tree. You don't want fruit for a few years until you get a tree becoming established. So vegetative just means it has vegetation, stems and buds. And then the fruit buds like this, that's what's going to produce your fruit. You don't want those for a few years. You want all the growth going into the actual tree. All right. So any other questions?
Do you know what would, have you ever intentionally grafted a fruit bud? What would happen?
Sometimes, like on the plums, you see a whole cluster. If you look real close, it's a whole bunch of buds jammed together. A lot of times the middle one will actually be vegetative. And there's been a couple of times where we had an old tree that was like dying and we wanted to save it, and it was so devigorated, it just didn't have any vegetative buds. Like, oh darn, what do? We gotta grow something. So we ended up cutting off a piece like those two I just handed out that have the perpendicular funky fruit buds, just grafted on. It did take and shot out perpendicular, this big crooked tree, and then you can just bend it, or as that grows, get some cuttings off of that and then regraft some more trees later. So if you're really desperate to keep a tree alive, so it can work. But like on this probably wouldn't work. It'd just give you a cluster of flowers and some apples. So you get apples the first year on a little bonsai fruit tree.
So, Sam, I'm not sure if we're going to talk about this or not, but this is my observations on the different fruit trees and when you want to cut the signs. Since we're having the exchange here at the end of this month, apples, you could cut them the day of and they'd be fine.
Yeah.
Plums, we're going to have to watch out. This warm day today and tomorrow and stuff,
Yeah.
plums tend to start coming early, and so you know, a couple times I waited too long, and
Yeah.
January sometimes. So if you have a good plum variety, you might want to go out and get it now.
Yeah.
Do it like what Sam said, store it in the refrigerator and protect it from drying out and stuff.
Right.
Apples will be fine. I mean, they're not
Yeah.
going to come out.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I miss plums almost every year. I'm like, oh, I'm going to graft that one, and all of a sudden it's like February. Oh no, how did I get February? I should have done it 3 months ago. And yeah, you want it, when you stick it in the refrigerator, that basically stops the clock. Because like you said, the plums may start blooming this week. I mean, it's been such a warm year anyway, but they're always early. And so you get in the refrigerator, it shuts it down. And the rootstocks, when you get them, they're usually more dormant. They come from cold storage.
So I lived in a house here in Arcata that had, I learned this from the Portuguese family that came and said they'd helped Uncle so-and-so graft a tree in our yard. And it was golden plums that tasted like peaches.
Oh, wow.
And it was exquisite.
Oh,
just
man.
amazing. And they would come every year and ask if they could get some of them. And first year I said sure, and they cleaned the tree off. And I said next year only take. But anyway, if you took a cutting off of that tree, would it maintain that cross, that peach plum, golden plum?
Yeah, whatever's on there, you're basically cloning, and that's why you graft, just so you can keep that true variety. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's see, where are we? How much time do we have? Not too much time, so I kind of skip over some stuff. I'll talk a little bit about equipment, and I use a lot of this equipment interchangeably. One of the most important things is your hand clippers, and most of the stuff you're grafting, especially the signwood, is pretty small diameter. You're talking 1/8 to 1/4 inch in diameter. And so if you go collect signwood, let's say there's a branch like this growing off of this tree and I wanted to graft it onto a rootstock, you know, your hand clippers are going to do the job. Sometimes, like with this stuff, if you're going to do a whole bunch of grafting, let's say you're going to have a grafting party in your neighborhood, you're going to want the bigger loppers to come and just hack a couple of big old branches that have a bunch of side shoots like I just chopped up a little bit ago. But those are your big kind of starting tools. And then whether you're grafting onto a branch of a tree or a rootstock, you're usually, again, going to use the loppers or the hand clippers to cut it down to where you want it. So typically, like on a tree like this, I go down somewhere fairly low within, you know, a foot or so of the ground, chop it off, and then graft onto it. And if you don't have a lot of experience, I usually recommend people chop it about 1 foot off the ground. Then if you mess up and your graft doesn't take, you still have 1 foot of rootstock to keep working down the next couple of years if you make mistakes. And if it does take, no big deal. You got 1 foot of rootstock that's nice and tough, and you get your tree growing up from that. So those are a couple of tools. I use this handsaw a lot just because, like, if we're reworking trees, grafting onto some thicker stuff, or, you know, I'm cutting big limbs off or whatever. But this is a nice little combo pack. Has my handsaw, my clippers.
So a good time, using the handsaw, if you're pruning your trees, it's a good time to take the scion.
Yeah, yeah. One of the most important things is your grafting knife. And over the years, I've seen a lot of different knives used. Pretty much every knife you can imagine, from utility knives, the contractor showing up at the class, to this custom-made spring steel giant buck knife that this hunting guide from Idaho came in with. And I was like, oh, I don't think that's going to work. He's all, whoosh, and the tree just went, oh, maybe it will work. That thing was like a samurai sword. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, literally, we should chop stuff and it just wouldn't even look like it was cut, and then it'd fall over. So the key, though, is something like that. It's laser sharp. And my dad's going to kill me when he finds out I've been telling this story every time. But one time we were both just grafting along, and he stuck his knife in his back pocket, but he forgot to close it. And oh, it just dropped it. Ooh, these things are sharp. At first you don't even feel it, and it just goes right through. And I've been grafting, and all of a sudden, how come the ground's turned all red? And I look, and there's a piece of my finger gone. Never even felt it. Just flayed it right off. They're wickedly sharp. And these Felco Victorinox grafting knives, you feel the blades like, oh, that just makes my bones hurt. It's so sharp. I mean, you can take a piece of fingernail and just takes it right off. And the angle of the blade, you know, if you're looking at the blade, it's so tight. It cuts really well. I've seen knives that are actually sold as grafting knives, but the blade comes out, and then right at the sharp part, it comes in like that. So you end up with this fat thing like a splitting maul. You're like, you waste so much energy trying to cut into it. It's just not efficient. Doesn't give you nice, smooth, clean cuts. And that's the two things. One is efficiency, not having to waste your energy, and the other is having a nice, smooth, clean cut. The smoother, cleaner cut you have, the less dirt and bacteria and debris you're going to get in there, the better matchup with the bark you're going to get when you're lining them up for grafting. So these grafting knives, and they always seem to be black, but there's Felco, Victorinox.
So it's double edge sharpened? It's to a point, it's not just a one edge? And then
Let me see here.
it's one edge?
It's one edge.
Okay.
But it's, I mean, if you guys come and look at these later, I don't want to pass them around, but it's just a wickedly sharp blade. And I had these white ones, I can't remember what the brand was, and I think they actually went like this, but the point was it was flared out like that, so it's just too fat. You look at it, it looks sharp and stuff. This will work great, but after doing hundreds of them in a season, you're like, man, my arm's tired and wasted a lot of time. You can do it a lot faster with better results. And especially when you get into cutting into thick, like half-inch, three-quarter-inch rootstocks or branches, that's when you're like, I mean, it's dangerous because you're putting so much force on it and slip and have an accident. Somebody have a question?
Yeah. Where do you get those? Can you get them around here locally?
Sometimes Miller Farms will carry them, and they're the only ones I've seen that carries them. And what's that?
What's the brand?
This is Victorinox. It's a Swiss Army brand. And Forestry Supplier is where I've always gotten them. They always have them in stock, and they're the cheapest that I've found. Oh, really? Okay, cool. And they have different lengths too. Like these ones I have are the longer blade one, and I really like these. It's just, it gives you that much more area to slash into. And then some of these are actually grafting budding knives where it's sharp, but then it has this bark lifter, so if you do the T-bud like on citrus, you can lift the bark up. So that's the only grafting knife I've used that I really like. The other ones that are sold as grafting knives and like regular pocket knives just don't have that right blade. Let's see, talked about clippers, sealants, some kind of tree seal. There's all different brands. I've never used one that I like better than another, as long as it's just black sticky tar stuff. When you make your graft, you put them together, after you wrap it with a tape, you just plaster this stuff over it and then plaster the tip of the cut you've made, and that dries on there and keeps the moisture in so your graft wood, your sign, doesn't dry out and die. Now, the other thing, like the knife, that's kind of the critical deal, there's all kinds of different tapes out there. There's some of them sold as grafting tape, and I remember when I first started my fruit tree nursery as a high school ag project, I grafted about 200 trees, I think, and then a windstorm came that spring and like 5 or 6, probably 6 out of 100 trees snap off and fall over. What's happened? It's no fair. And the grafting tape was like this gauze, really heavy-duty tape that didn't rot in the UV light, and it didn't expand as the tree grew. So above and below the graft union, the tree was expanding in size, diameter, and then it didn't right there, and it basically just pinched the tree off, and the wind blew and snapped them off. And with this plastic, like electrician's tape and a number of different tapes, this stuff doesn't break down very well in UV light. This one might stretch a little bit, but still it really constricts the tree and starts cutting into the bark. And so I found, and there's a number of these types of tape, but it's very specific. Rubber electrician's splicing tape, rubber lined electrician's splicing tape. It has this blue liner on it so it doesn't stick to itself. You cut off a section of this, and then you peel the blue backing off, cut it off, and then this stuff stretches, so as you wrap it onto your graft, it's pulling back and grabbing onto it, tightening down that graft to hold it together. And it sticks to itself, so it locks together and holds the moisture in, and it breaks down in UV light. So after several months, it's disintegrating and disappearing, and your tree just takes off and grows in diameter like nothing ever happened. So I've used some other like rubber splicing tape that wasn't lined and different types, and they just weren't the same. This rubber lined electrician's splicing tape is the best stuff you can get, and this was something you're not going to find in the textbooks and in most classes, but I learned from some old timer. I can't remember who now, but one of the old timers taught us this like 20 years ago before he passed away.
Where do you get that?
You can get this at any hardware store.
True Value Hardware Electricians Department.
And the key is to pull the blue off of it?
Yeah, you peel the blue stuff off because it's just a plastic liner, and once you peel that off, then the tape that contacts itself fuses together and makes like a cast. And so even if like it starts raining and washes your tree seal off immediately, at least around the grafting, you've got a nice tight seal that bugs and air can't get into. So that and the grafting knives are two pieces of equipment that aren't mentioned in any grafting textbooks but are critical.
Do you consider that better than like paraffin? I got something. I went to the Signwood Exchange down in Sonoma County a year or two, and it was like a paraffin tape or something. What's it called?
Parafilm.
Parafilm. Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't used that.
Okay, so that's your favorite then?
Yeah. When I first started as a kid doing grafting, they had other stuff like this grafting wax and these different types of tapes, and you put this grafting wax over it, and you had to heat it up. It was just real cumbersome. This stuff is so easy to work with. You just then plaster that stuff on there, and it's good to go, and it breaks down real quick.
Sam?
Yeah.
There's examples down here of the tape that you can see what's happened since April.
Oh yeah, here.
The one in front of Sam is the rubber splicing tape, which is already starting to degrade. You can see what he's talking about. And the tree to his left is another apple tree that was grafted with the vinyl tape, which is the stuff that doesn't break down. So you can see an example of each of those grafts.
And a lot of these you'll have to come back and actually slice it off, and then you're cutting into the tree and stuff. And like I mentioned, the one I used, it was sold as grafting tape. It's probably still in the market. It's like this white, looks like the kind of stuff you'd wrap up a wound with or something, but it was really thick, and you'd have to come back and slice that up, and then you're cutting into the bark and stuff. And I lost about 6% of my trees for the first couple of years because of that, pinching them off. This stuff just stretches and it breaks down with the UV light. I mentioned disinfectant. I like to, if you're doing a bunch of grafting, having some first aid supplies is a real good idea. Do you have a question?
I was just going to say it's really important to label everything.
Yeah, and I actually have that. That's the next thing on my list is labels. I don't know if anybody else is like me, but my experience has been most people are the same. You get like 3 trees down the row. Wait a minute, was that Golden Delicious or Walton? I can't. It's lost. Now you don't know what it is. So take the time. Each one get a label, and you can temporarily just use like nursery tape, that green stuff or anything. But the metal aluminum labels that you take a ballpoint pen and actually indent into, they're really slick because they don't. The ink on like using the green tape or plastic label or tape. The ink, even indelible ink, breaks down super fast in UV light. I can't tell you how many hundreds of trees me and other nursery people I know have lost because they didn't do a good job of labeling. You go to pretty much any nursery and tell me, oh, you can just take that flat of plants, we're not sure what they are. So these aluminum tapes or labels are really great, but back it up with a map. Get a map on your computer, get a hard copy somewhere, because I pruned an orchard one time. This guy hired me a couple of years to prune his orchard. And all these cool bird nests up here. Uh-oh, which tree is off of that? Is that off of? And you go around his orchard and like ask him, what variety is it? He's like, I'm not sure, the labels disappeared. So birds steal labels. Labels disintegrate, they fly away in the wind, they disappear. So it's a good idea to have a map to back up your label system. And then one other tool I'll mention that most people probably won't use, but I end up using a good bit, is I have a pole pruner, and I use that to get sign wood up high. A lot of times you're going collecting sign wood from a big tree, and you just can't even reach any good wood. Or even if there's some halfway decent wood, you look up, oh, that branch is perfect, and just without having to mess around with a ladder. So that's another good tool for collecting sign wood if you need it. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit about some of the different equipment and demystified that a little bit. There are a few other things you'll see, like the paraffin tape stuff you mentioned. There's also, you can order rubber bands. These are actually really good, super stretchy, and I actually prefer these when I'm doing, so say I'm really limited on my sign wood and I'm getting stuff that's 1/8 of an inch or smaller, and it's so delicate that you start wrapping that tape on it, oh, it falls on the ground, you line it back up. This stuff is just, there's almost no resistance here, so it's really good for doing fine grafting on really small diameter stuff. These are just grafting rubber bands. They're a little bit cumbersome because once you get down you have to tie them off, and then you can kind of foul up and knock your graft wood out of alignment. But it's just, another tool in the toolbox. So since I'm running low on time, I'm just going to kind of go through the basics of grafting real quick. And as an example, I'm going to use this big thick piece, which would not be ideal because it's just so thick and hard to cut. The old wood from last year is way harder than the fresh vegetative tips like this stuff. But like I mentioned, there's a number of methods of grafting. I'm going to show you the whip graft, which is a really high success rate graft, and it's for doing something like this on smaller rootstocks or smaller twigs. It's an extremely useful tool. So basically what you're doing, that's amazing. I mean, this is really hard wood, it's just no effort. You're cutting an angle, and if it's a thicker piece of wood like this, I like to make a fairly long cut. So like an inch long cut, that's not long enough for me. I want to go about 1.5 inches. And the idea is to get as smooth a piece as possible. There we go, get past the knot. Okay, so I'll kind of step out here real quick so you can see that. Basically just cut an angle like that. And then I go about halfway down that face and I cut kind of straight down into it.
So
and this is,
you're splitting it.
Yeah, you're splitting it basically right down the middle.
In parallel to the face, or?
So I'll show you here. About the depth of the knife blade, like that. And this is the part where you could, hey, look, my thumb. So you have to be super careful. I put my thumb down here and lock my hand up. So if I slip, I'm going to hit myself with my thumb. And you just don't put a ton of pressure. I just kind of rock it and be super careful. Razor sharp blades. So now I have a face with a cut in it. And then, so I'm rapidly running out of time and video tape. I'm just going to take this piece. It's not as thick as I'd like to match up with that, but just to give you the example. I'm going to do the same thing, and this is, you wouldn't believe how often this happens. Not paying attention, you make your cut on the top of this, and now you have an upside down graft that's not going to grow. Make sure you're on the bottom. The buds are up here. It's funny how often anybody can do that. Actually, we did something, oh no, we grafted what, plum onto apple or apple onto plum last year. Oh, you gotta pay attention to what you're doing. So now I do the same thing. I'm gonna cut a nice face there, and then cut my, split the sign wood. And now I'm just gonna slide this down so the two slices I made jab into each other. That looks pretty good. And the idea is to have the two, not the flat green face there, but the edges, the bark, to line up. And that cambium, that light green stuff inside there, once that lines up, it'll just fuse into each other once it's wrapped up. So this is what it should look like, and you can kind of pass that around. But I scooted that top scion piece over to the edge so the bark of the scion wood and the rootstock are lined up. And then I just start from the bottom with a piece of this tape, wrap it up till that whole chopped area is wrapped, plaster it with this, dab some of this on top, and you got a graft. And plums and apples are pretty easy to graft. Apples are super easy to graft. They just, I mean, there's some room for some abuse on those and from lack of skill, and they'll typically take. And like I said, if you have a foot of rootstock and you mess up next year, just chop it off and try it again. So that's pretty much the basics of grafting. I have a couple minutes for questions.
I was just wondering about your technique. If you have a rootstock in a pot, you had the rootstock in your hand and you were able to hold it and do this. But what's your method?
Pretty much the same basic thing. I typically will grab it and pull up this way. You don't stab yourself in the gut, but just do that, pull up, and get the same type of face, and then you get your sign wood that you just stick them together. Any other questions?
I just wanted to share that I was doing some grafting. I'm not, I'm certainly not I'm a beginner, and I was using different kinds of knife, and then I used a serrated knife. And that seemed to work really well because, you do your thing, and then there's that tongue. They call it the tongue, where like there's a little bit extra right on the edge of it. And the serrated knife the serration was just about right for like a pencil thick scion wood, and it went, and I just wanted to share that. I don't know if you had experience with that. It worked really well, and like my textbook on fruit tree, it was all like all the blades that they recommended were just straight blades. Your blades are straight.
Must have been a really sharp knife.
Sharp knife.
Yeah.
But I think the groove there on the serration was
just right, huh?
So last year when we did the scion exchange and we were at my place, we said they did some apple on plum, which obviously didn't take. But one of the branches got plum on it, and that one plum, there are actually 2 plum scions that were put in that one. They grew 6 feet.
Wow!
This was not on a little tree; it was on a bigger tree.
Yeah.
A lot of bigger. The apples, we did 5 different varieties on one of my older apple trees, and each one of those grew about 3 to 4 feet.
Yeah.
From the small rootstock.
That's a good point. At my dad's orchard, when we regrafted, he had trees that were like 15 years old, and we chopped them down to basically nothing. I mean, the trunk was here, the main scaffold branches were here. We chopped them down to like a foot of main scaffold branch, and they were old varieties that got scab, and he didn't want to be spraying, so we converted them over to the newer disease-resistant ones, stuck sign woods on there using the cleft graft, and in 2 years, they caught back up to the other trees in production and size. 2 years, I mean, basically circumvented 13 years of growth because those little scions have this massive root system. So yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Are peaches difficult to graft?
Peaches are typically almost impossible to graft. Yeah, it's we've grafted hundreds of peaches with no success, and then we finally found the right rootstock. It's a couple of rootstocks. If you get normal peach rootstock, it won't grow, but there's one you have, right, that is compatible with peach. Which one's that? I can't bring.
St. Julian?
St. Julian, yeah, it's a plum, but the peach grafts onto it. And then there's another one that I was telling you about.
Lavelle?
Yeah, a Lavelle rootstock. And they're a little bit hard to come by, but when you get them, there are some nurseries that have them. My dad sometimes will have some, and they are super compatible to peach. So that's the key there, is having the right rootstock. Like I said, you can grow peach to peach, it just doesn't work. All of a sudden you find this one plum, boom. All right, so I think we're out of time
So
here.
just really quick before we end the filming of this. So January 31st is Saturday. That's when we're having our second annual scion exchange. We invite you to collect scion wood from established trees in the area that have shown to be very productive and shown some disease resistance. And bring photos, bring dehydrated fruit or preserved fruit to represent the scion if you can. Otherwise, just plan on bringing some description.
Yeah, some description
of your variety that you're sharing. We encourage you to do that. If you have any questions, please get a hold of me after the talk. Also, at the day of our event, Sam, his father, and Mark DuPont will be there doing grafting demonstrations for the 3 hours. So if you come to our event, you'll get a little bit more hands-on grafting, which obviously he couldn't get to everything today, but we'll cover some more stuff that day. So thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.
Good job.